All right, good evening, folks. It's Enforcer Matt, and welcome back to another short war summary. And today we have some pretty big news coming out of Ukraine of another advancement on the Russian front lines by Ukrainian forces that we'll get into in just a moment. We've also learned some more details about those F16 deliveries by the West, as well as specific timelines regarding those deliveries. And finally, we have learned of another Ukrainian drone attack on Moscow that the Russians tried to cover up and were then later embarrassed when more footage came out, proving them to be lying. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into our first news article of the day, which is about that Ukrainian advancement. And we learned here that the Ukrainian army has entered Robotyne. And of course, I know I'm butchering that name slightly, but it's pretty tough for me to pronounce those Ukrainian names, so please excuse the pronunciation. And also, by the way, this post is from Visegrad24. And on the Deep State UA map, which we can see here, we see that the Ukrainian forces have taken a decent section of that town. Here in the blue circle, you can see the area, and around it, you can see these red squares, and that indicates Russian defensive positions. And this area is crawling with Russians, to say the least, and I'm sure that was very difficult fighting on the Ukrainians' part to get into this area. And it's also going to take a lot of work to hold this ground as well, because the Russians are going to be under massive pressure by their incompetent leadership to try to go in and push those forces back out of the town and to reclaim the land. Right now, Russia is playing a very defensive game, trying to hold off the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are playing an offensive game, which is a much tougher position in my opinion. So the Russians have the slight advantage of being deeply entrenched, and the Ukrainians have the disadvantage of having to push right into those deeply fortified positions. So, with that piece of news out of the way, a very positive piece of news by the way, let's move on to our next post here. And in this video, we can see that the Russian media reports an explosion in Moscow. And let's go ahead and enlarge this video and see what we're looking at. And we can see in the background, there's a large puff of white smoke coming out of the middle of Moscow. And it's very difficult to tell exactly what has happened from this footage because we don't have a lot of context. But in the later post, we learn exactly what has happened, and we see that the Ukrainians have struck once again. And in this one right here, we have a post from the Kyiv Post that says, Moscow mayor claims the drone over the Russian capital was destroyed, says Russian state media. So this tells us that it was most likely this drone right here that we see in this video, which I'll enlarge and play real quick so you can see. And some of you will notice right off the bat, this video has been reversed for some reason. The drone is flying backwards, and that is because of the video being reversed. Or actually, it could be one of those weird drones that has the propeller in the back and the wings in the front. I don't really know for certain, but that drone was heading toward Moscow, and it was going to hit a target. So, in the next post here, we learn that the Ukrainian drone made its way through Russian air defenses and struck Moscow, and the drone attacks against Moscow have now become routine, and the city's inhabitants will have to get used to them as long as Russia's war of aggression continues. And we'll have to wait and see if the Moscow residents can actually adapt to this. I have a feeling they're not going to adapt really fully like the Ukrainians have. I have a feeling it's going to lead to some civil disobedience, which will be bad for Putin's regime as well. But in this video right here, this is somewhat interesting. This is actually a TV capture of a rowing contest in Moscow. And in the left corner over here of the screen, you're going to see in just a moment that explosion that we saw earlier in the corner. So as you can see, there was an explosion. They're going to zoom in here for just a second. And there it is. And that was caught on live TV in Russia during this rowing contest, funnily enough. So that blew the whole Russian story that they destroyed the drone and it didn't hit its target. So the Russians basically, in essence, played themselves, to say the least, like they do all the time, actually. So moving on to our next article here, we have one from Nexta. And it says, police officers with anti-drone guns are spotted in Moscow after a drone explosion. And this is the Russians' way of trying to make the Russian civilian population feel better about the whole situation, like their officers are prepared to deal with it. However, what the Russians apparently don't know is the drone gun that he's carrying is not designed for the type drone that hit that we saw in those videos before. This anti-drone gun is mainly designed to combat civilian consumer drones like DJI Mavics and things of that nature, and not large drones like we saw that hit. So this is theater for the Russian public, and also I really doubt that these officers have been properly trained on how to use this weapon, even against these civilian drones. So once again, the Russians are trying to play the propaganda game instead of the actual military game that they should be playing to deflect these drones from hitting Moscow. So with that being said, and that little funny piece of news out of the way, we have a post from the Kyiv Post, and we're going to switch gears just a little bit to talk about the F-16s. Here we learned that the first group of 6 Ukrainian pilots will complete training on the F-16s no earlier than the next summer, reports the Washington Post. And this article goes on to say that the lengthy training period is due to the fact that the pilots, despite fluent English, must take a 4-month English language course in order to learn the terms associated with the jets, and the pilots will start training on fighters only in January, and the preparation will take 6 months. And I have to say, to me, it has become so apparently obvious that the West is trying to hold up the transfer of F-16s that it is appalling. Right now we see in this post that the pilots, despite fluent English, meaning they already know English, must take a 4-month-long course to learn the terms associated with the jets. That to me is blatant stalling. They're not even really hiding it very much anymore. The West isn't. The West is not ready to give over these jets. To me, that is becoming a more concrete conclusion every single day, and this to me is proof of that. And the timeline keeps getting extended and even again on the training. So I'm not sure exactly if Ukraine's ever going to receive these F-16s, and if they do, it may be with so many caveats or too late that it's completely useless. So we'll have to wait and see. And of course, if you disagree with my assessment, please put it down in the comments below, because we always like to hear other opinions on it to see where everyone else is coming from. But moving on here, after the Russians learned of that news about the timeline on the F-16 jets, they decided to lash out against Ukraine. And during the missile attack today, the Russians tried to kill young Ukrainian pilots who were going to train on F-16 fighter jets. And we learned that the Russians struck an airbase where these pilots are being currently housed in an attempt to try to assassinate them. And this was said by the spokesperson of the Ukrainian Air Force. So the Russians are very, very opposed to Ukraine getting those F-16s for very obvious reasons. Those jets would allow Ukraine to have air superiority in Ukraine, which would allow them to have an advantage over the Russians. The Russians right now have air superiority to an extent. Of course, their pilots are very horribly trained, and their jets are not necessarily the best in the world, but they still have an advantage over Ukraine in that respect. But if Ukraine were able to get F-16s, they'd be in a much better position. And I have a feeling that Ukraine would find out that the Russian air defense is not as good as they thought, because right now the Russians don't have to worry about it. And also we have to factor in the incompetence factor here, that the Russians don't prepare for pretty much anything, and they'd probably get caught off guard by it. So, with that piece of news out of the way, we're moving on to our next article, which is from the Kyiv Independent. And we talked about this last night on our stream as well. It says the Yandex co-founder denounces Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And we can see here that he is the co-founder of Russia's most popular search engine. Yandex is basically the Russian equivalent of Google, and he has denounced Russian aggression. And that was published by the independent outlet called Meduza in Russia. And this fella here, from my understanding, does not live in Russia anymore, so he's not in immediate danger. But that doesn't mean he's out of the woods yet, because Russia has been known to lash out and assassinate people anywhere in the world, especially in the UK. A lot of assassinations have happened there, former spies, and also people that have left Russia. And this guy could be in danger. So we'll have to wait and see how good his security is and whether or not he keeps his windows locked or not, because, you know, the Russians love to fall out of windows. So moving on to our next post here, we learn of a possible motivation for the Yandex co-founder to make that statement out of the blue. We learned that the possible transfer of Yandex to affiliates of Russian First Deputy Presidential Chief of Staff Sergei suggests that Putin seeks to reward this fella here for his personal loyalty, particularly following the June 24th Wagner Group rebellion. And for some reason, Putin decided to transfer some of the Yandex assets or some of their holdings to these people in the government. We know why he did that. It's basically a reward for loyalty during the coup attempt. But that must have angered the Yandex guy quite badly, because that seems to be a motivation for him making that statement suddenly out of the blue, and that probably added to it. I strongly doubt that the Yandex co-founder simply made that statement because he's opposed to war, and I have a feeling he did that to try to harm Putin as revenge for transferring some of these Yandex assets out to his cronies. So that's my speculation, but of course there could be other reasons involved as well. And with that, moving on to our next news article. This one is from Visegrad24, and it says Zelensky announces that Ukraine is sending humanitarian aid to Slovenia after the country experienced its worst flooding disaster in modern history. And Zelensky says, we help our friends even as we fight a war at home, and solidarity works both ways. And right off the bat, I gotta say, to me, I applaud this effort by Ukraine. I think that's good. They're helping out their neighbors. Even in such a tough time of need in their own country, they are still helping out others. Now, on the other hand, I have to examine the counter-argument to this, because it is pretty obvious to me that some people are going to object to this for some reasons. First off, we are giving a ton of money to Ukraine for humanitarian aid. The West has designated that aid specifically for Ukraine. And now it looks like Ukraine is sending some of that aid back out to other places. While it's a noble effort, at the same time, I can see that people might object to it because, for one thing, that if Ukraine has enough aid to send to other places, then why are we sending so much to Ukraine? That would be one argument. So I'm going to leave it up to y'all what y'all think about it. To me, I think it's a good thing, but some people might object. And with that, moving on to our next article here, we have one from the Kyiv Post, and this was a pretty big story, by the way. Zelensky is once again having to battle corruption in Ukraine. Today, he dismissed all regional military commissars, and to my understanding, these people were in charge of recruitment in these regions. Apparently, they found after an inspection of these commissars that they were deeply entrenched in bribery and also corruption, which Zelensky labeled as treason. So Zelensky took the bold move of firing and sacking all of them all at once, and now they're all gone. So Ukraine will have to replace these people with new people. But once again, when you're dealing with widespread corruption, sometimes extreme measures like this are necessary, and apparently Zelensky thought it was. So that is the action he took to address it. And finally, moving on to our last news article of the day, we have one from Nexta, and it says Germany may agree to provide Ukraine with Taurus missiles if they are programmed not to hit Russian territory, and that was reported by the Spiegel magazine. And here we see that Germany is willing to provide those missiles, those Taurus missiles that Ukraine has been asking for quite some time now, but with the major caveat that they cannot hit Russian territory. And on one hand, I do understand why Germany would want that included, because they're trying to protect their own interests. But to Ukraine, that is probably a pretty big downside, because they'd probably use those missiles to hit Russian territory. But of course, Ukraine has demonstrated to the West that they are not scared of striking into Russia, and I think the West has been slightly off-put by that, and it's going to cause a holdup with these weapons right here. So that could be a reason for it. But with that being said, that is our last news article for the day. Of course, we will cover the rest of the news as it comes out throughout the day on our stream tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern. Feel free to join us tonight. Also, please press like on this video and subscribe as well for regular updates. We also have a Twitter page, and be sure to peep the Twitter. Our Twitter handle is at It's the Enforcer. I almost forgot it for just a second. And we post the news out there every single day, minute by minute, to keep you updated on what's happening in the war. We also have a Patreon page as well. The link is in the description below, where you can support us monetarily to help us keep doing these videos. So once again, thank you all for watching. I hope it's been informative, and we'll see you later on. So bye-bye for now.